Well, it's Tuesday, the 7th of July, 2020. We're back again on the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. Brand new show where we bring you 5 of the big stories making waves in the world of sport every weekday morning. And I'm always joined by one of Australia's best journos. Today, Christy Doran's with me. How are you, C-Dors?
Very well. Nice and early. Good to join you again.
Fantastic. Let's rip straight into it. We're going to start today from NRL.com and a story from Brad Walter. His column, Emotions Boiling Over in 2020 Pressure Cooker. He's gone through and he's explored some of the ways in which players, Joey Leilua with his self-destructive high tackle, Adam Fanua-Blake obviously abusing the referee after Manly's late loss on the weekend, but also a whole bunch of other examples from coaches and players throughout this year with their emotions, I'll try that again, spilling over. Essentially, we've got an extraordinary circumstance this year in the NRL. We've got an amended fixture. We've got some new laws and restrictions in place around COVID as well. Do the extraordinary circumstances of this season, Christy, mean that we need to give the players a little bit of a leeway for their failure to control emotions?
I think it depends if you're having a failure of emotion in terms of it going over the edge and you're doing a blatant high tackle and a brain explosion is what the article points out. There's a difference between, I think, high, aggressive, dangerous behaviour and what we saw with Brisbane over the weekend, where you had a couple of players in particular, Brodie Croft, Alex Glenn, emotions spilling over, clearly, visibly distressed and distraught after their 6th straight defeat of the season. So you've got to separate them to a large extent. And we saw only a couple of weeks ago, Latrell Mitchell, who has had the spotlight over him for many a season, visibly distressed in the training rooms after a starring role in a victory. I think it was over the Bulldogs, but we saw Wayne Bennett comforting him, and yes, I think we do need to give a bit of leeway to these players that are playing in high intensity games. That clearly sport is playing a huge vehicle for helping a lot of society out and bringing back a sense of normality. And they're playing a key role in bringing normality back to society.
So essentially what you're saying, emotions in terms of releasing their own emotions, the likes of Ivan Keary blowing a kiss, okay. Head high tackler abusing a referee, can't blame that on emotion.
No, you can't. And we saw Jake Friend as well on the weekend kick the ball away after giving a penalty that allows Melbourne to beat the Roosters. That's somewhat of a brain explosion, but we don't really mind that. That's what you like to see as a punter, as a coach, and as a spectator. You like to see those sorts of acts.
For those of you watching on Facebook or YouTube, you'll see the Golden Strainer has made its first appearance of the morning. That's how I let my journalist guests know that we need to move on to the next topic to keep it short and sharp. Our next topic takes us to South Australia. Liz Walsh and Simeon Thomas-Wilson in the Advertiser there. South Australian Premier Stephen Marshall has left the door open for further investigation through Safe Work SA into the Adelaide Crows' controversial 2018 camp. Now, this is a story that's bubbled away for 2 or 3 years now. The camp obviously came on the back of the Crows falling short in the 2017 AFL Grand Final against Richmond. They thought they were pretty well set up to go again and try and win a premiership in 18, and perhaps tried to address some of the mental frailties in that team to go one step further. The absolute opposite's happened. They've had about 9 players leave the club since then, many of them citing that camp. They've had Indigenous players really upset about some of the ways their culture were represented on that camp. And we've had this drip feed of information. We've had reviews. We've had investigations into the organisation who put the camp on, who perhaps didn't have a lot of qualifications in the space. It's a fairly ugly situation which has played a pretty critical role in Adelaide Crows' current malaise. Do you think it's fair enough that actually we need an independent review, we need a government review into what happened? Or is that just, this is sport and that's kind of South Australian Premier Stephen Marshall overstepping the boundaries a little?
The idea that this is sport and everything else just goes out the window, I don't agree with that at all. But there has been players that have come out and recently in that article that have said, look, we're trying to put this behind us. He might not have been there at the time, nor were a number of middle tier players either. But this seems like a pretty extreme circumstance. And I don't think you should just gloss over those, because there still are a number of players that are still there. There's still people from the club that are still there. When you've got blokes that are asked to crawl on the ground and have childhood experiences and traumatic experiences yelled at them as they're expected to complete objective after objective, I think that's definitely going beyond the mark, and they would have known what was coming for them. Yes, it was an external company that had set up the camp, but we've seen camps for many a day in many a sport, and famously Shane Warne in cricket, he used to hate these sorts of camps. And that was one of the reasons why he didn't get along with John Buchanan, the former cricket coach. Yes, I think that at times external reviews are important.
Yeah, of course, Shane Warne, that famous line, I think a coach is the way that you get to the ground for the match. Our third story today, and the one we're going to get a little bit more in depth on, comes from Jamie Pandaram in the Daily Telegraph. He's exploring the Giteau Law, which, for those unfamiliar, essentially players who played Super Rugby in Australia for 7 years and have reached 60 Wallabies caps become eligible to represent Australia if they move to play in one of the high-paying, glamorous overseas competitions. There's talk that due to a crisis in availability of international test quality locks and second rowers, that Giteau clause might be amended again to allow incoming Wallabies coach Dave Rennie to select the likes of Rory Arnold or Will Skelton or even an Adam Coleman or Isaac Rodder. I've got a couple of questions for you on this, but I'm going to start off with, does the Giteau law need to change in this circumstance to allow Australia to field test quality locks?
The number one point that I would make is I absolutely don't think it should be thrown out the window. There needs to be some criteria which will restrict the movement and discourage players from going overseas. There's been the likes of Mark Ella, who have said, and the former brilliant Wallabies fly half captain, who have called for it to be dismantled, particularly in the day and age where Super Rugby might not be as attractive as it once was. I think that in exceptional circumstances, I like the way that they're going down, which you can pick 2 or 3 players. And I think 2 is actually probably better, because 3 and you're starting to really loosen up the criteria. But 2 players that you can pick in any position, and that would roughly be what we've been seeing in recent years anyway. In 2015 World Cup, only 3 players qualified for that, and 2 of those 3 were picked. George Smith was the unfortunate one that didn't. Wales have used that model beforehand, and we saw the likes of George North, the winger, picked, but we couldn't see Reece Webb, the outstanding halfback, picked, so he came back. I think 2 or 3 players is the right move, and it allows you to really target a position of weakness.
Take your point, but at the same time, I wonder, let's say first test of the season, you pick Rory Arnold and Will Skelton in your second row. One of them picks up an injury. So next week you bring Adam Coleman in. He has a blinder. All of a sudden you've got 3 in the squad. And it's a slippery slope from where I'm looking. And I just wonder whether if you ease the restrictions any further, the ultimate, where we're going to end up, the inevitability is that we're like the Socceroos and all of our best players are playing overseas, and we're simply picking a representative team based upon that. And to that point, it would actually alleviate a lot of the financial pressure on Rugby Australia. If they weren't paying salaries to a lot of their top Wallabies, they were just paying them for test match appearances.
Yes, and the financial burdens are something that Rugby Australia knows all about in recent months and years. I think still, though, the idea that 60 tests, 7 years of eligibility for the service, we're seeing at the moment a number of players that qualify for that at the moment. Yes, I think 2 or 3 players isn't enough to open up the dams. I really do think that. I think it's a model that has been used elsewhere. But I spoke to Kyle Godwin yesterday, the Western Force player who's played a test match for Australia, and he said that he really just wanted to come back to Australia to play rugby. He'd spent a couple of years in Ireland. He's only 27, just turned 28 actually, and he wants to play for the Wallabies, spend time in Australia and play Super Rugby.
I'm going to move across the ditch now and return to rugby league. Chris Ratui in the New Zealand Herald. Really interesting article on the New Zealand Warriors private owner, Mark Robinson, who really only took over the club within the last 12 months. And already, despite the extraordinary circumstances of this season, he sacked head coach Stephen Kearney, and he's come out publicly and said that Blake Green and Jared Beale won't have their contracts renewed at the end of the year. A lot of people pretty disappointed, none more so than Green himself. The veteran playmaker who's been a pretty steady influence on that club during a couple of tumultuous seasons, pretty disappointed with the manner in which he was spoken about publicly and the way in which that news came out. On the one hand, you've got a situation where you might think this is a private owner acting recklessly, saying what he wants, doing what he wants, and it doesn't bode well for that club. On the other hand, that's a club that has really done nothing in this competition consistently since its existence. Is it actually what the Warriors need? Where do you stand on it?
Well, Chris Rattu, the columnist there, he's a person that makes waves in both rugby league and rugby union. Is a well-known one, so I find it interesting that Chris Rattu writing about the story. But we've seen in numerous sports, probably none more so than in the EPL, where owners come in and they demand results. That, as you pointed out, the Warriors have struggled. They've made the occasional grand final appearance, but they've struggled historically. I think the important thing to spell out at the moment is the timing, and that's something that Todd Payton, who's the coach at the moment there, and Chris Rattu finished with this in the story, was the timing's not great. And when you've just got rid of sacked your coach, you've got a new assistant coach in there, I think this just has the ability to continue to disrupt the season going forward. Now it comes off the back of a victory, a cellar dweller victory over the Brisbane Broncos. It's not ideal timing, absolutely not. And when you've got players that are being forced to play in Australia at the moment because of coronavirus, it has the ability to really fracture already a fractured playing group.
A final story today, we're going to head to Detroit, Michigan, where Bryson DeChambeau has come away, and I'll look up the name here again, the Rocket Mortgage Classic on the PGA Tour. DeChambeau, a 3-shot victory there. Not unusual because he has had 7 top 10 finishes in his last 10 tournaments. But the unusual thing here is that DeChambeau has used the stand down of the PGA Tour during the coronavirus to put on an extra 45 pounds, 20 kilos in our terms, in order to give him a better power game. He's the longest driver in the sport. Is this what the body shape of professional golfers is going to be moving forward, Christy?
Oh, perhaps for some that can put on weight, others might not be able to. But we've seen the cases in Australian golfers as well, with Jason Day trying to put muscle on, Tiger Woods also trying to bulk up, and it really had the reverse effect. It's meant that they've had more injuries. And consequently, they're spending lengthy times out of the game. We've seen Adam Scott in more recent times as well go back and not get in the gym, doing a lot of Pilates. I don't think it necessarily is the prototype. It is a type, though, and I think every body really is different to each human. You've got high performance people and strength and conditioning coaches, which are always going to look for extra gains. But I think it's a really slippery slope that if you think that everyone that bulks up is naturally going to, it's going to correlate to better results. It's an outstanding result, and we saw from Bryson DeChambeau him hitting the ball a country mile. It's paid off now, but whether or not he can stay on the course for years to come, we'll see.
As a man who finds time for 9 or 18 holes most days of the week, I'll be watching with interest to see whether you start reaching for that protein shake suddenly. Christy, that's all we've got time for today. Fantastic to have you on the show. Make sure you subscribe to the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff via the podcast app, Spotify, and of course you can follow us on Facebook and YouTube. We're running out of time, but Christy, really quickly, your one to watch in the world of sport today.
Oh, the one to watch is probably the movement. We'll stick with Super Rugby at the moment, and just the continuing discussion with the broadcast, because that is really going to impact with the Giteau Law. The two are inextricably linked, and if you get more money, you'll see more players stay in Australia, and you won't have to contemplate the Giteau Law.
That's the stopwatch telling us that we're right on the edge of the time that we've got set aside. Of course, 5 big stories, less than 15 minutes, out by 8 o'clock. Christy, we'll talk to you soon. Thank you, mate.
Cheers.